Lady Sarah Ashcombe carries herself the way old portraits are painted, with a dignity that costs something. Her platinum silver hair is woven into a crown braid that falls in soft waves behind her, catching candlelight like moonbeams on still water. Her complexion is pale and smooth, the kind that makes her dark. Expressive eyes land harder, sharper, like two questions you are not sure you want answered. In the opening ballroom scene, she wears a cream gown stitched with silver embroidery shaped like crescent moons and trailing vines along the sleeves and shoulders. Her posture never breaks, not once, even when her world is dissolving at her feet. There's a determined set to her jaw, and a guarded stillness in her expression that hides something enormous, a woman who feels everything and shows nothing. Edward Miller, the Duke of Ravensmere, does not enter a room. He arrives at it, like the weather. He has short, dark brown hair, textured and slightly unruly in a way that contradicts the rigid perfection of everything else about him. His face is sharp-featured and ruggedly handsome, with a jaw that carries the light shadow of stubble and amber-tinted eyes that burn with something conflicted, something old and unresolved. He wears a heavily tailored, dark leather traveling coat, with a high collar and black leather gloves. Pinned to his lapel is an antique silver wolf badge with glowing orange eyes, not decorative, but declarative. A statement. His posture is tightly controlled, slightly inclined forward, as though he is always bracing for something. And in his most unguarded moment, a single tear traces a path down his cheek, cutting straight through every wall he has ever built. The ballroom of Whitmore Hall had never seen a quieter kind of cruelty. 300 candles burned in chandeliers above polished floors, and silk gowns swept past like the pages of a book no one wanted to be written out of. Crystal flutes clinked. Laughter lifted and curled like smoke. Somewhere near the far wall, a string quartet played a waltz bright enough to make you forget your sorrows, if you had not already become one. Lady Sarah Ashcombe stood near a gilded column on the east side of the room, a champagne glass pressed lightly between her fingers, and a smile she had rehearsed since childhood fixed perfectly to her face. She had not moved in nearly 20 minutes. She had not needed to. The ballroom had quietly arranged itself around her absence, the way people rearrange furniture after a death, carefully, deliberately, pretending nothing had changed. But everything had changed. That morning, the papers had confirmed what rumor had been whispering for weeks. Ashcombe Trading, the transatlantic shipping firm her father had built over 30 years, was gone. 3 vessels lost to a brutal winter storm off the coast of Nova Scotia. The insurance claim was rejected. The creditors are already circling. The family estate in Northamptonshire had a lien against it before her father could even reach his solicitor's office. By noon, their accounts were frozen. By evening, their name had become a cautionary tale passed over dinner tables with the bread rolls. Sarah had known it was coming. She had read the letters. She had watched her father's hands shake at breakfast. She had heard her mother crying softly in the blue sitting room 3 nights in a row, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth, as though grief were something you could muffle if you tried hard enough. She had come to the Whitmore ball anyway, because the Ashcombe women did not surrender rooms they had earned the right to stand in. But standing her ground was one thing. The silence surrounding her was another entirely. Gentlemen who had spent the better part of 3 seasons angling for an introduction now discovered urgent conversations on the opposite side of the room. Young women who had copied her hairstyle and borrowed her opinions on literature now looked through her the way you look through a window when the weather outside is too grim to acknowledge. Even Lady Clifton, who had pressed Sarah's hand warmly at the Haverstock dinner not 3 weeks ago, managed to find tremendous interest in a painting hung directly behind Sarah's left shoulder. Society, Sarah was learning, did not abandon people dramatically. It simply stopped seeing them. She took a slow sip from her glass, tasting nothing, and kept her eyes forward. Then the music faltered. Not dramatically, just a half-beat's hesitation, as though the musicians had looked up at the entrance and lost their place. The sound resumed, but the room had already shifted. Conversations dropped in volume. Heads turned. The elegant tide of moving bodies slowed almost imperceptibly, the way water does when something large moves through it. Edward Miller, Duke of Ravensmere, had arrived. He was dressed in dark formal attire, with that high-collared traveling coat unconventional for a ballroom, entirely typical of him. The silver wolf badge on his lapel caught the candlelight as he paused at the threshold, scanning the room with amber eyes that held no warmth and required none. He was not the tallest man in the hall, but he was the one the room arranged itself around, the way planets arrange themselves around gravity. He had not attended a ball of this kind in over a year. His presence alone was news. His silence was policy. His reputation as cold, exacting, impervious to social theater had made him the most discussed and least understood man in the whole of England's aristocracy. Sarah watched him enter the way you watch a storm roll in from the window, with perfect stillness and the private knowledge that you are not ready for what comes next. His gaze moved across the room. It passed over the cluster of hopeful mothers near the entrance. It skimmed past the young lords competing loudly by the drinks table. It swept through the center of the floor, where the most celebrated faces in the ton turned subtly to catch his attention. And then it stopped. On her. Sarah felt the precise moment it happened, the way you feel a change in air pressure before lightning. She looked away. I looked back. He was still watching. And then, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never been refused anything in his life, he began walking directly toward her. The room noticed. Of course it did. He stopped 2 feet from her and said nothing for a moment. Up close, the Duke was more formidable than his reputation suggested, which was saying something considerable. His gloved hands were clasped loosely behind his back. His expression was unreadable in that particular way that made it impossible to know whether he was bored or fascinated, though somehow both felt equally dangerous. You have not danced tonight. His voice was quiet, not gentle exactly, but precise. Every word placed with intention. I find I am between partners, Your Grace. Something shifted in his gaze. Not warmth, not sympathy. Something more calculated, and somehow more unsettling. Then dance with me. It was not a request. It was a door he had already decided to open. Sarah held his gaze for 3 full seconds, long enough to be neither flustered nor accommodating, and then she placed her hand in his gloved one. The whispers that moved through the room were instant and absolute. By the time the waltz was half over, every pair of eyes in Whitmore Hall had found them, and the Duke danced with the same precision he did everything else, perfectly, correctly, and with a controlled awareness that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing and had calculated the consequences to the last decimal. Midway through the second turn, he spoke again, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You are aware, I imagine, that this changes things. It changes what people think. That is not quite the same as changing things. The faintest shadow of something moved across his face. She thought, for just one moment, it might have been approval. I will call your family tomorrow afternoon. There is a business matter I wish to discuss. Sarah did not reply immediately. She let 2 full counts of the music pass before she answered. Then we shall expect you, Your Grace. By the time the waltz ended, the whispers had become conversations. By morning, they would become news. And by the following week, they would become history. But standing in that ballroom, with the music settling around them and 300 people pretending not to stare, Sarah Ashcombe had no way of knowing that she had just taken the first step into the most complicated, painful, and ultimately extraordinary chapter of her life. She only knew that for the first time that night, she had stopped holding her breath. A moment with you, hey. Quick question, how are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It genuinely means the world to me that you chose to spend your time in this story. Stories like this one only reach the people who need them most when voices like yours help carry them forward. So if Sarah's courage just caught something in your chest, please hit that subscribe button right now. Smash that like. And drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. I want to say hello to every single one of you. I want to know exactly how far our story is traveling. It helps more than you know. All right. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Now let's get back to Ravensmere. Edward Miller arrived at the Ashcombe estate the following afternoon at precisely 2 o'clock, which told Sarah everything she needed to know about him before he had opened his mouth. Punctuality of that order was not about respect for the appointment. It was about control. The estate had once been elegant. It still was, technically, The way a woman who has not slept in 3 days is still beautifully structurally correct, but carrying something exhausted behind the eyes. The drawing room where Sarah received him smelled faintly of old roses, and the particular worry that seeps into upholstery when a household has been running on anxiety for too long. A small fire crackled in the grate, more for dignity than warmth. Her mother, Catherine Ashcombe, sat to Sarah's left on the settee, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone pale. She had been crying that morning. The powder she'd applied was good work, but grief is not easily concealed when it lives in the eyes. Edward took the chair across from him, removed his gloves with the practiced efficiency of a man who wasted nothing, and stated his terms before any tea had been poured. I will clear the outstanding debts against this estate and its associated accounts within 72 hours of our agreement. Your sister's dowry funds will be placed in a protected trust under separate legal counsel beyond the reach of any future creditor, regardless of circumstance. Your mother will retain use of this property for the duration of her life, should she wish it. These protections are immediate and unconditional. Sarah listened without expression. Her mother made a sound that was half relief and half anguish, the sound of someone who has been bracing for a wave and finds it is gentler than expected, which somehow makes it worse. And what are your terms, Your Grace? In exchange, a household, respectably managed, publicly maintained. I require a duchess who is capable and composed. I do not require sentiment. The word landed cleanly, without cruelty, which somehow made it cut cleaner. You are describing a position, not a marriage. I am describing a partnership, which, historically, has proven more durable than a marriage built on feelings. Sarah studied him for a long moment. He was not unkind. She could see that. He was something more difficult than unkind. He was honest in a way that left no comfortable edges to hold on to. She thought of her sister Margaret, 18 and terrified that she would never have a season now. She thought of young Clara, barely 16, who had started tutoring the neighbors' children quietly, without telling anyone, to help with the household expenses. She thought of her mother's hands, pressed together on that settee, like a small prayer. She thought of herself, and all the things she had wanted for a marriage that had nothing to do with financial rescue. Then she set those things aside, neatly, carefully, the way you fold something precious before you put it in a drawer. Very well, Your Grace. We have an agreement. There was no smile from Edward, but something in those amber eyes acknowledged her briefly, the way one chess player acknowledges another after an unexpectedly strong move. The wedding took place 6 weeks later at St. George's, Hanover Square. London attended the way London always attended weddings that confused them in full force, with excellent clothes and competing theories. The general opinion held that the Duke must have lost a wager, or won one, depending on who you asked. Sarah wore her grandmother's pearls and a gown the color of winter cream. She walked down the aisle the way she had stood in that ballroom, perfectly straight, entirely composed, with an ocean raging somewhere behind her eyes that no one in the pews had the clearance to see. Edward waited at the altar in his formal coat and that silver wolf badge, and when he turned to face her, his expression was what she was beginning to understand as his default, controlled, watchful, and entirely unreadable. When he placed the ring on her finger, his touch was careful, almost gentle, the kind of care that suggested something contained, something that was choosing its shape deliberately. She would spend months trying to understand what it meant. What neither of them knew yet, what would only become clear much later, through layers of careful legal research, was that the collapse of Ashcombe Trading had not been purely an act of weather and misfortune. The storm had been real, but the insurance rejection had not been random. The financial architecture that had made the Ashcombe losses so sudden, so catastrophic, so perfectly timed, bore the fingerprints of deliberate sabotage. Edward Miller had discovered this 4 days before he walked into that ballroom. He had said nothing about it. He had simply shown up, asked for a waltz, and built a legal wall around her family before the architects of their ruin could complete their work. Sarah would not learn this for a very long time, and when she did, it would change everything she thought she understood about the man she had married. Ravensmere House sat 12 miles outside of London in the kind of countryside that looked like a painting and felt like a verdict. The main approach was a long gravel drive flanked by oaks so old they had watched 3 generations of Millers arrive and leave without comment. The house itself had enormous 6 wings, 50-odd rooms, a library that required a rolling ladder, and a personal philosophy just to navigate, and it was breathtakingly, achingly quiet. Sarah arrived as its new Duchess on a Tuesday in late January, and spent her first afternoon walking through rooms that seemed to have been perfectly preserved and entirely abandoned at the same time. Every surface was correct, every curtain was pressed, every fire was laid, but the house did not feel lived in. It felt curated, the way a museum feels, beautiful and orderly, and not designed for anything as ordinary as a human heartbeat. Edward showed her the estate with the efficiency of a man running a tour of a property he was considering selling. Thorough, informative, utterly impersonal. The East Library is organized by century, then subject. The housekeeper, Mrs. Perkins, manages all domestic matters and addresses anything of that nature to her. The tenant accounts are reviewed quarterly. I will handle those. Of course. And the tenant schools? I noticed 2 of the cottages near the south gate have children who appear not to be attending. He paused. Just briefly. The schools have been inactive for some time. It has not been a priority. I would like to make it one, if you have no objection. He looked at her then. With a particular quality of attention, she was learning to recognize not warmth, exactly, but a heightened focus, as though something she had said had moved from the ordinary category into a folder he had not expected to open. You may do as you see fit with the charitable operations of the estate. They fall within your remit as Duchess. She thanked him. He nodded, and then he retreated to his study, and the study door closed, and Sarah stood alone in the east corridor of Ravensmere House, listening to the sound of a house that was enormous and entirely empty of the thing she had not known she would miss. Ordinary warmth. The months that followed developed their own rhythm, as all marriages do, comfortable and uncomfortable in turns. Edward was never cruel, never dismissive, never cold in any way she could point to directly and name. He simply maintained a distance that had its own architecture, polite, correct, and precisely calculated to keep everything at arm's length. He read his correspondence at breakfast instead of speaking. He answered questions completely, but never introduced new ones. He was present at dinner and entirely absent from it at the same time. And he had the particular gift of making a woman feel perfectly respected and quietly invisible, which, Sarah was discovering, was its own unique kind of loneliness. Some nights she would hear him moving in the hallway well past midnight, or see the strip of lamplight beneath his study door at hours when the rest of the house had long gone dark. Once, near the end of February, she had come downstairs for water and found him at the library window, standing without a book or a letter, just looking out at the dark grounds with an expression she couldn't classify. She had stopped herself at the doorway, watched him for a moment, then went back upstairs without announcing herself, because something about the way he stood told her she was seeing something he had not chosen to share. But the estate began to change. She reopened the 2 tenant schools within her first month, hiring a young woman from the village named Miss Reed as the morning teacher and organizing a curriculum herself that mixed reading, arithmetic, and basic household accounting. She introduced a lending library for the tenant families. She reorganized the estate's charitable donation records, which had not been properly maintained since Edward's mother had died 11 years prior, and discovered significant funds that had been sitting dormant, simply because no one had been managing them. She applied for them. The tenants noticed. The servants noticed. Lord Matthew, Edward's oldest friend, noticed when he came to dine in March and watched the Duchess quietly redirect a conversation about a flooding problem in the South Cottages into a concrete plan with a timeline and a budget. Edward noticed too. He simply said nothing about it. But sometimes, late in the evenings when he thought she was not watching, Sarah caught him pausing in doorways, or setting down a letter he had been reading to look up at nothing in particular, as though his thoughts had just handed him something unexpected that he wasn't sure what to do with. She was falling in love with her husband. She knew it the way you know the name of a song before you have remembered it, something already present, already moving, already slightly too late to stop. She also knew it was a catastrophically unwise thing to be doing, because Edward Miller was kind to her. He was fair, protective, and genuinely excellent at running an estate. But he was not interested in being loved. Or if he was, he had decided somewhere in his past, somewhere dark and particular, that she could not yet see that interest of that kind was not something he could afford. She decided she would simply manage it, keep the feeling private and contained, not let it make her foolish or demanding or soft in ways that would embarrass them both. She was Lady Sarah Ashcombe, after all, now the Duchess of Ravensmere. She had survived a public ruin without flinching. She could survive a complicated feeling without performing it. So she thought. The conversation she overheard happened on a Thursday evening in April, 4.5 months into their marriage. Lord Matthew had arrived for dinner that afternoon, one of his occasional visits that Edward seemed to neither particularly encourage nor discourage, the way you feel about reliable furniture. They were good friends in the way men of that generation were good friends. Through years of proximity, shared history, and an unspoken agreement to never press each other on anything that mattered. Dinner had gone well enough. Sarah had been bright and attentive and had, she was fairly confident, successfully concealed the particular weight she had been carrying for the past 3 weeks, which was the growing and inconvenient realization that being near Edward Miller had begun to feel like standing next to a fire she was not allowed to warm herself at. She had retired early, citing a letter she needed to finish before morning. The men had moved to the East Library for brandy, as they usually did. The East Library door was old, and its latch did not fully catch unless you pulled it firmly. She had mentioned this to Mrs. Perkins twice. It had not yet been attended to. She came down the hall to retrieve a book she had left on the reading table near the door, a volume on estate accounting she had been annotating, and stopped when she heard her name. Or rather, she heard the word wife, and in the particular pitch of the conversation, she knew it was about her. She should have turned around. She did not. Lord Matthew's voice came through the gap clearly. She is remarkable, Edward. Anyone can see it. The schools alone, the tenants, talk about nothing else. You must see that you have been given something extraordinary. There was the sound of a glass being set down. She is capable. I have never suggested otherwise. I am not talking about capability. I am asking whether you have any affection for the woman you married. A silence. Then, in the measured, deliberate tone she had come to know as Edward's most controlled register, affection has no place in the management of this house or this partnership. It complicates judgment. It introduces variables that undermine stability. I married her to resolve a specific circumstance. What I feel in regard to that arrangement is duty, and duty is sufficient. So you feel nothing for her. I respect her. That is not nothing. But no, there is no more to it than that. The hall was very still. Sarah became aware, in a distant and slightly clinical way, that she had stopped breathing. She was also aware that she was standing in the corridor holding a book on estate accounting, and that her fingers had gone cold. She turned. I walked back down the hall, went upstairs, closed the door of her room with the careful precision of someone who cannot afford to make a sound. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the far wall for a very long time. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the blue sitting room of her father's estate to last a considerable portion of her adult life, and she had decided in that room that she would not spend whatever came next in the same position. But something settled in her that night, like a stone going to the bottom of a deep, clear lake. Quiet, final, already too far down to retrieve. Duty, respect, no more than that. Fine. She had agreed to a partnership. She had always known what this was. She had simply, somewhere in the past 4 months, forgotten herself enough to want it to be something else. She would not make that mistake again. What she did not know could not know, standing alone in her room at 10:30 on a Thursday in April, was that the conversation she had just overheard was not what it appeared to be. Edward had known for 2 days that the spy servants placed in the household by the banking family responsible for her father's ruin were listening. He had sent a letter to his solicitor that morning confirming it. The East Library, with its door that did not fully catch, was exactly the kind of place a man who understood surveillance would choose to have a conversation he wanted overhead. He had staged it. He had said those words deliberately, precisely because he knew certain ears were listening, because allowing his political enemies to believe he held no emotional attachment to his wife meant they could not use her as leverage against him. Making himself appear cold was the last shield he had left to wrap around her. He did not know she had been in the hall. He would not know it for a very long time. And in that gap between what was said and what was true, something began to come apart at exactly the seam that held them together. If Edward noticed a change in his wife, he gave no immediate sign of it. To be fair, the change was not dramatic. Sarah did not weep at breakfast or freeze him out with obvious deliberateness. She was far too well-bred and far too proud for theater of that kind. What she did was something quieter, and in the long run, far more effective. She simply stopped looking at the door. That particular habit of glancing toward whichever door Edward was most likely to come through, of noting when he entered a room, of calibrating her own mood to the subtle shifts in his disappeared within a week of the library conversation. Quietly, completely, like a clock that has decided to stop keeping someone else's time. She filled the space with other things. The tenant schools expanded to a second session on Saturdays. She began hosting a small reading circle on Wednesday afternoons for the wives of the estate workers, something that had no precedent in Ravensmere's history and no particular authority behind it other than her own. She corresponded with 3 social reformers in London whose work on women's economic education she had been following quietly. She redesigned the estate's household accounts with a new categorization system that Mrs. Perkins told her, with considerable emotion, was the first sensible improvement to the records in 11 years. She also began dressing differently, not extravagantly. The change was more precise than that. She began choosing gowns in colors she actually liked, instead of colors she had calculated as appropriate. She stopped wearing her hair in the severe crown braid on days when she had no formal engagements. She laughed more openly at dinner, at the things that actually struck her as funny, instead of offering the measured, polished responses she had been deploying like small diplomatic treaties. She became, in other words, more entirely herself, and the world, which is sometimes slower than we think, and sometimes faster, begins to respond to it. At the April charity auction at Pemberton House, the Duchess of Ravensmere caused something of a sensation by offering 3 exceptionally eloquent minutes on the value of women having access to financial literacy education. The applause was unexpected. The conversation that followed went on considerably longer than anyone had planned. 3 invitations arrived the following week, then 5 more, then a note from Lady Hargrove, who chaired the most influential charitable board in the county, asking if the Duchess might be available to consult on their funding structure. Sarah said yes to all of it. She was not doing it to punish Edward. She was not doing it to be noticed by him. She was doing it because it turned out that when you stop waiting for someone to hand you a purpose, you can find one entirely on your own, and yours fits considerably better. But Edward noticed anyway. It was not the invitations, exactly, or the charitable board, or even the conversation at dinner that had changed in timbre and energy. It was something smaller. It was the fact that she no longer looked at him when she laughed. She had used to. He had catalogued it without meaning to the habit she'd had of glancing in his direction after something amused her, as though checking whether he'd caught it too, as though his response to it mattered. He had not known he was registering it until it stopped. He found himself irritated by things he could not name, found himself aware, in the mornings, of whether she was still in the breakfast room before he entered, found himself noting, in meetings with a solicitor, that he had lost the thread of a sentence twice in an hour, which was not a thing he did. He said nothing about any of this, because he did not yet have a language for it. He had been taught, very thoroughly and quite early, that the correct response to discomfort was to increase the distance between yourself and its source. His father, the previous Duke, had been a man of rigorous emotional architecture, a man who had viewed sentimentality as structural weakness and vulnerability as an invitation to be exploited. Edward had not been raised. He had been constructed, and the construction had served him very well for a very long time. It was only now, watching his wife move through their shared house with a new and entirely self-sufficient brightness, that he was beginning to notice certain cracks in the walls he had been living inside. He did not know what to do about those cracks yet. He had not developed the relevant skills. So he did nothing, which was, as Lord Matthew would later tell him with considerable feeling, exactly the wrong decision. The Hargrove Spring Gala was one of those events that existed less for entertainment than for the performance of social standing, a sort of large, elegant audit of who mattered, who was ascending, and who had made poor decisions recently. Sarah attended in a gown the color of deep sage green that she had selected without consulting anyone's opinion. She had borrowed nothing. She had adjusted nothing. She had arrived with a quiet confidence that had not been in her possession 12 months ago, and which several women at the event immediately resented, and then quietly tried to emulate. Edward accompanied her and spent much of the first hour in conversation near the fireplace with 2 members of Parliament, which was precisely the kind of company he gravitated toward at events like this. Not because he found it more interesting, necessarily, but because politics, at least, had rules he understood. Sarah circulated. She spoke with Lady Hargrove about the charitable fund restructure. She listened to a lively argument between 2 scholars about property law reform. She ate something small from a tray and described it correctly as cardamom-infused pastry to a woman who had spent 20 minutes trying to place the flavor. And then, on the East Terrace, just after 9, the young Viscount of Alderton appeared beside her with a glass of wine she had not asked for but accepted anyway, and proceeded to be genuinely, effortlessly charming. His name was Thomas Alderton, 26, recently returned from 3 years, traveling the continent, with easy manners and the particular social skill of making whoever he was speaking to feel as though they were the most interesting person in any given room. He had opinions on estate reform that were not entirely uninformed. He laughed easily and without calculation. Sarah laughed back. Not performing laughter, not the measured, diplomatic variety, the real kind, the kind that catches you slightly off guard and arrives before you've decided whether it's appropriate. And Edward, who had just extracted himself from the parliamentary conversation, crossed the room in time to see it. He stopped near the entrance to the terrace. He watched. Lord Matthew appeared at his elbow with the quiet reliability of someone who has spent many years being useful in exactly the moment before things become complicated. That is young Alderton. Good family. Just back from Florence. Very fashionable at the moment. Edward said nothing. She looks well tonight. Edward's jaw tightened in a way that was subtle enough that only someone who had known him for 15 years would have caught it. Lord Matthew had known him for 17. On the terrace, Alderton said something that made Sarah tilt her head back and laugh again, and the sound of it carried across the evening air with complete unconcern for Edward's current emotional architecture. Something dark moved through him, something old and primitive and absolutely not categorized anywhere in the disciplined filing system he had developed for his own emotional life. It felt remarkably like an alarm. It felt, if he were being entirely honest, which he was trying very hard not to be, like the specific terror of a man who has been slow to understand something and has just received the bill for his delay. He crossed the room. He did it without planning to. He was simply on the terrace, between them, before he had made any conscious decision to move there. My Duchess. His voice was perfectly level. Nothing in it betrayed the last 3 minutes. Sarah looked up, and her expression was pleasant and entirely neutral, the expression you give a person you are comfortable not performing for. Your Grace, do you know Lord Alderton? He has been telling me about the agricultural reforms he observed in Lombardy. Alderton stepped back with appropriate deference. Edward acknowledged him with the minimum necessary courtesy, and then turned to Sarah. I believe they are beginning the next movement inside. Shall we? Sarah glanced back at Alderton with a brief, genuine smile. Please excuse us. It was a genuine pleasure. She walked back inside beside her husband, and for several minutes neither of them spoke. And then, very quietly, Edward said, You seem to enjoy that conversation. I did, yes. He is interesting. Another silence. You have been enjoying a great many things of late. She looked at him, not unkindly, but with a steadiness that landed somewhere between question and answer. Yes, I have. And she left it precisely there. That evening, on the carriage ride home, Edward sat across from her in the dark and tried to identify what he was feeling. He ran through the options methodically, the way he ran through estate ledgers, looking for the discrepancy. It was not jealousy. He refused to accept jealousy as the correct classification. It was a concern for the integrity of the household's social reputation, for the impression of impropriety. Yes, that was it. He looked out the window into the passing dark and let himself believe that for approximately 4 minutes, at which point Sarah made a small sound in her sleep, she had fallen asleep sitting up, elegantly, in the way she did most things, and something in his chest moved without his permission, and he stopped lying to himself with quite so much conviction. It took 10 more days. 10 days of circling each other in the large, quiet rooms of Ravensmere House, with the particular energy of two people who have too much to say and have each decided, for entirely different and equally wrong reasons, that saying it would be worse than the silence. Edward began finding reasons to be in rooms she occupied. He reviewed correspondence in the morning room, which he had never done before, because the morning room was where Sarah took her tea. He lingered near the library door in the late afternoons, because the late afternoon was when she read. He asked Mrs. Perkins, with studied casualness, about the progress of the tenant school's second term. Sarah noticed all of it and said nothing. She had spent 4 months being careful with him. She had spent 3 months pulling back. She was not prepared, at this point, to extend herself again toward someone who had told his closest friend, through a door that did not quite catch, that there was nothing more to their marriage than duty. She was managing it well enough. She was busy. She was purposeful. She was genuinely, measurably happier than she had been in January. And then, on a Thursday morning that began like all the other Thursdays, her solicitor's letter arrived. It was not addressed to Edward. Her solicitor, a careful man named Mr. Elias Vance, whom she had retained independently 6 months ago at Lord Matthew's quiet suggestion, had been doing preliminary research into the original insurance rejection that had destroyed her father's shipping business. He had found, buried in the subcontracting records of a Lloyd's syndicate, a series of communications that were not consistent with the standard claim review. They were, however, very consistent with deliberate interference. The name that appeared repeatedly in those communications, not prominently, not carelessly, but present, the way a fingerprint is present, was Harwick & Sons, a private banking consortium that had, she now learned, been attempting for 3 years prior to her father's collapse to acquire the transatlantic trade routes that Ashcombe Trading controlled. Her family had not simply been ruined. They had been targeted. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she went to Edward's study and knocked on the door. He answered immediately, which told her he had not been expecting her. He answered the door himself, which told her he had been alone. "I need to show you something." She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it in the silent, focused way he read everything thoroughly, without visible reaction, taking in everything before expressing anything. When he looked up, his expression was careful. "Where did you obtain this?" "My own solicitor. Independent research. I commissioned it 5 months ago." A pause. Something complicated moved behind his eyes. Sarah. It was the first time he had ever used her name, without the title. She registered it somewhere behind her sternum and said nothing. "I need to tell you something. I should have told you this before." And then he told her about the intelligence he had received before the ball, about the legal wall he had constructed through their marriage, about the stage conversation in the East Library that part came with visible difficulty. And she understood why, and the political enemies who had been listening, and the reason he had said the things he had said. He told her all of it with the flat, careful precision of a man who has spent years keeping things close to his chest and is experiencing what it feels like to open the chest and find it full. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Sarah sat across from him. She thought about the night in her room after the library. The stone goes to the bottom of the lake. The decision she had made, quietly and finally, that she would not be foolish enough to love someone who had told her, with absolute clarity, that he could not love her back. The stone was still there, but it was not as settled as she had believed. "You were protecting me." "I was. That was genuine." "And the rest of it? What did you say to Lord Matthew about duty and respect?" His jaw tightened. He looked at his hands, then back at her. "I said what I needed to say for the ears that were listening, but I will not pretend, standing here now, that none of it was also what I had told myself was true. I had convinced myself for a long time that the arrangement was what it was, and that being honest about its limits was a form of integrity." A long pause. "I am not certain anymore. that I was correct about that. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he had the experience, possibly for the first time in his adult life, of not knowing what was coming. Then she stood. I need some time, Edward. I need to think. Of course. My aunt has asked me to visit her in Bath. I think I would like to go. His face did not change, but something happened in those amber eyes that was not quite controlled. It was the expression of a man who has calculated everything except for the one variable that was always going to matter most. When would you leave? The day after tomorrow. He nodded once. She left the room. He sat back in his chair and looked at the wall. The house, that evening, was the quietest it had ever been. Lord Matthew arrived the next morning, uninvited, because he had heard from no one in particular, and also from everyone that the Duchess was preparing to go to Bath. And he had known Edward Miller for 17 years, and had a general professional obligation to the continued functioning of people he cared about. What exactly did you say to her? The truth. Which part of the truth? Enough of it. Edward, you told the woman, through a library door, that you felt nothing for her beyond duty. She built an entire life inside this house on the assumption that that was what she was. And now you have told her it was a performance for an audience she did not know was there. And your solution is to say you told her the truth and let her go to Bath. A long silence. What is it actually that you feel for her? Edward stood by the window. The grounds were visible below, early summer green, with the south garden where Sarah had replanted the roses in March. His voice, when it came, was quiet. She is the only person I have ever met who makes this house feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. Lord Matthew sat down slowly. Then you need to tell her that. Not the diplomatic version. Not the managed version. Her. Tomorrow morning. Before she gets in that carriage. Edward said nothing for a long time. Then he turned from the window. The morning Sarah was to leave for Bath, a fog rolled in off the grounds before dawn and settled over Ravensmere House, like something that had been waiting for exactly this occasion. She came downstairs at 8:30 in her pale traveling gown, hair neatly dressed, face composed, carrying the particular steadiness of someone who has made a decision and intends to honor it. Her trunks had been loaded the night before. The carriage stood on the gravel drive below, horses patient in the mist. Edward was waiting in the entrance hall. He was not wearing his traveling coat. He was standing, slightly less controlled than she had ever seen him, in his morning attire, with his hands at his sides instead of behind his back, which, for him, was the equivalent of another man coming apart completely. Sarah descended the last few stairs and stopped at the bottom. The footman held the front door open. Beyond it, the fog swallowed the gravel drive. You did not need to see me off. I did. The footman, possessed of excellent professional instincts, closed the front door quietly and found something to attend to in the next corridor. Edward stepped forward. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see everything his face was doing, which was considerably more than it usually did. I have been trying for the better part of 2 days to identify the correct order in which to say the things I need to say to you. I have not succeeded, so I am simply going to say them. Sarah waited. She was very good at waiting. It was one of the skills she had developed in this house. I do not know how to do this. I want you to understand that from the beginning, because I will do it badly, and I think you deserve to know that its inadequacy is a function of its honesty, not its limits. Something shifted slightly in her expression. She did not speak. My father was a man who believed that feeling something for another person was a structural failure, that it gave the other person a weapon they would eventually use. He was not wrong about the mechanics of it. He was wrong about the conclusion. He decided the solution was to feel nothing. I decided the solution was to feel nothing and call it principle. He looked at her steadily. You arrived in this house in January, and you changed it. Not by trying to. Not by requiring anything from me. You simply were here, and that was sufficient to change everything. Sarah's eyes were very still. I watched you rebuild what was broken here without being asked to. I watched you fight for people who had nothing to offer you in return. I watched you become larger and freer, and more entirely yourself with every month that passed, and I was the one standing in my own study pretending this was an ordinary arrangement and that your name didn't mean something specific when I said it. His voice was under control, but only just. The night I said those things to Matthew, the things about duty and respect, and nothing beyond that, I said them for ears that were listening through the library door. I did not know you were also outside that door. I would have found a way to tell you all of this considerably sooner if I had. He took one more step forward. I am not asking you not to go to Bath. If you need the distance, I will not stand in the way of that. But I will not let you get in that carriage believing that you have spent 8 months in this house being tolerated. I will not let you leave thinking I am indifferent to whether you come back. He stopped. His hands were not quite steady. She saw it. I love you. I have loved you for longer than I have the vocabulary to account for, and I am aware that saying it now, as you stand in your traveling gown next to a packed carriage, is an embarrassing quantity of too late. I also think you should know it regardless. The entrance hall was very quiet. Outside, the fog moved softly across the grounds. The horses shifted on the gravel. Somewhere inside the house, a clock registered the half hour. Sarah looked at the man in front of her, at this complicated, fiercely controlled, deeply frightened, structurally honest man who had built a legal fortress around her family before she had ever learned his middle name, who had staged a performance of his own coldness to keep her safe from enemies she hadn't known existed, who had been slowly coming apart at the seams for 3 weeks because she had stopped looking at the door when he entered. She thought about what she had wanted at 23, before the ruin. She had wanted honesty. She had wanted a person who chose her with full knowledge of what choosing her cost. She had wanted to be seen by someone who actually looked. She thought he had never looked at her, but he had been looking the whole time. He had simply not known, until now, how to say so. She crossed the remaining distance between them. She did not throw herself forward. She was not a woman who threw herself anywhere. She moved toward him the way she did most things, with complete deliberateness and full knowledge of what she was choosing. And she placed her hand against his chest, over the wolf badge on his lapel, and felt the degree to which his heart was not, in fact, as steady as he had always presented it. I never wanted you to be perfect. I wanted you to be honest. You have been, now, even when it cost you. That is worth considerably more than a perfect man who never tells you anything true. He exhaled, long and slow and complete, as though he had been holding it since January. His arms came around her carefully, the way he did everything that mattered with absolute attention and the specific tenderness of someone who is acutely aware that they are holding something they cannot afford to damage. She let herself be held, entirely, and without managing it. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift. In the weeks that followed, the matter of Harwick and Sons was referred to a parliamentary commission, which Lord Matthew had been quietly helping to assemble for months. The deliberate manipulation of the Ashcombe insurance claim was documented, formally investigated, and brought before the proper legal authorities. The banking consortium, exposed in open record, lost 3 major clients and 2 government contracts within 60 days. Their attempt to acquire the Ashcombe trade routes was never completed. The Ashcombe family name was formally cleared of all implication of financial mismanagement. Sarah's father, who had not spoken at a dinner party in 11 months, gave a small toast at Christmas that year that made her mother cry for entirely different reasons than she had the year before. The tenant schools at Ravensmere expanded into a formally chartered education program, one of the first of its kind in the county, offering accounting, literacy, and household financial management to women of working backgrounds. It was modest. It was real. It quietly changed the material circumstances of 47 families in its first 2 years. Sarah was named to the county charitable board. She accepted and immediately proposed 3 structural improvements that were implemented within the quarter. Lord Matthew attended the small dinner celebrating this appointment and spent the majority of the evening looking between Edward and Sarah with the expression of a man who has watched a very long, very slow, very important thing finally arrive where it was always supposed to go. Edward, for his part, was learning, slowly, imperfectly, and with the specific stubbornness of a man who approaches transformation the way he approaches everything else thoroughly, once he has decided to commit. He was learning that vulnerability is not the same thing as weakness, that being known by someone is not the same thing as handing them a weapon, that his father had been brilliant and powerful and deeply, fatally wrong about the most important conclusion of his life. He was learning this in ordinary spaces, At breakfast, where he began setting his correspondence aside. On walks through the South Garden, where Sarah had replaced the neglected roses with varieties she had chosen herself. In the East Library, in the evenings, where they now read together, with the door properly latched, she had spoken to Mrs. Perkins a third time, and this time it had been attended to. He was learning it in the way he said her name. Just her name, without the title, which is the simplest intimacy, and the one that costs the most for men who have spent their lives keeping everything at arm's length. And Sarah was building something that had always been hers to build, just waiting for the particular conditions that would allow it to stand. A life that was entirely her own within a partnership that was genuinely equal. A purpose that existed because she had decided it should, not because circumstances had forced it or someone else had permitted it. She was also, in quieter moments, allowing herself the things she had carefully folded away and placed in a drawer 8 months ago. She allowed herself to love him back, openly, without managing it, with the specific courage of a woman who has survived enough to know that the things worth having are the ones that cost you something. Ravensmere House, at the end of that first year, was the same house it had always been. The same long oak drive, the same enormous rooms, the same library with its rolling ladder and its centuries of accumulated knowledge. But it was no longer quiet in the way it had been quiet before. It had a different quality now. The kind of quiet that is not absence, but rest. The kind that happens when something has finally arrived where it belongs, and the searching is over, and the house can simply be what it was always built to be. A home. What this story teaches us. There is something worth pausing on before we go. This story is set in the 19th century, but it is not really about the 19th century. It is about the things that do not change across centuries. The ways people are taught to protect themselves that end up isolating them instead. The ways silence gets mistaken for strength. The ways love goes unsaid until the cost of saying it becomes the only alternative to losing it entirely. What happened to Sarah's family? The deliberate manipulation of their financial circumstances by a more powerful party was not fictional in its mechanics. Throughout the 1800s, the legal and financial systems in England were structured in ways that made middle and upper-class women almost entirely dependent on male relatives or husbands for economic survival. Under the coverture laws that existed before the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, a married woman could not own property, enter contracts, or retain her own earnings in her own name. She was legally absorbed into her husband's identity at marriage. What Sarah does in this story, managing tenant accounts, creating charitable programs, retaining her own solicitor, building institutional relationships through charitable boards, reflects the real strategies that historically literate and resourceful women used to build economic agency within the narrow channels available to them. These were not small acts. They were significant, creative applications of limited legal space. They mattered, and Edward's journey learning to dismantle the emotional architecture built by a damaging father reflects something equally real and equally important. The research on intergenerational emotional patterns is clear. The ways our parents modeled or failed to model emotional honesty shape us in deep and durable ways. Unlearning those patterns is possible. It is also genuinely difficult. It requires the specific courage of being willing to be seen in the process of not yet knowing how. That is not a weakness. That has never been a weakness. True strength is not the absence of vulnerability. It is the willingness to be fully known by another person, even when that knowing costs you something. It is the decision to tell the truth even when the truth is complicated and late and imperfect in its delivery. Sarah and Edward's story is about that decision, made in a foggy courtyard, at exactly the right moment, which was also, by any reasonable measure, approximately 8 months too late. It turns out that is often how it goes. The important thing is that they got there. Hey, quick question, how are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to me. I want you to know that making this story brings Sarah and Edward to life, building every chapter, getting every detail right that takes real effort, and every single piece of your support makes it worthwhile. So if this story moved you, if Edward's confession at the carriage door hit something in you, or if Sarah's quiet courage to rebuild herself in the middle of silence made you feel seen, please take 10 seconds right now. Hit that subscribe button, smash that like, and drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. I genuinely want to say hello to every single one of you. I want to know exactly how far this story is reaching. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you are watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. It helps more than you know. All right. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart. A final word. Thank you for traveling to Ravensmere. Sarah Ashcombe walked into a ballroom in ruins and walked out of it into one of the most difficult, most instructive chapters a person can live through, the chapter where you learn that you are stronger than your circumstances, that your worth is not determined by what society decides to see in you, and that the people who love you most are sometimes the ones least equipped to say so out loud. Edward Miller was not a villain. He was something harder to navigate than a villain. He was a good man who had been taught wrong things about how to be one, and who had the specific human experience of learning to unlearn that publicly, imperfectly, and just in time. These are not small stories. They are the stories of every person who has ever been misread by someone they loved. Every person who has ever said something false because the truth felt too dangerous. Every person who has ever rebuilt themselves quietly in the rooms of their own life, without anyone noticing until suddenly everyone did. Value honesty in your own life, not just when it is comfortable, but when it costs you something. That is when it matters most. Until next time, stay inspired, stay purposeful, and know that courage is almost never perfectly timed. It only has to be real. End of story.